when a proposal like this comes out that's so sweeping. And looking at Europe as a great example of that, what is it that U.S. companies can look at when they see a proposal like this?
Well, the question is going to be how much of it is going to be really taking shape, because the SEC is asking for a lot of different mandates. So they want you to align yourself to more or less the TCFD, Task Force on Climate Financial Disclosure mandate. So how many companies can successfully do that? And how can they avoid greenwashing? Where are they going to get all this information about their company from? Because they don't have any climate experts in-house. So they'll have to figure this out. And of course, several of the companies in certain spaces, like let's say energy, it's much easier to do it in that sector rather than companies like manufacturing or plastics manufacturing and so on, where it's kind of a little more tricky to figure this out. So not only are they asking about scope 1 and 2, they also want you to start thinking about scope 3, which is the supply chain. Most companies don't have a handle on. And they also want you to give, statements on climate risk into the future, which is another problematic area for many companies. So it's a lot of ask, and companies are not so well prepared. They will get to that stage, but a lot of things have to change. And of course, like you pointed out, they could use Europe as an example and perhaps think about how did Europe do it, and can we sort of copy something in terms of all these frameworks and standards that exist out there and put it into the US system also. It can be done, but it's a lot of effort. And we don't know if because of politics, some of the things are going to be derailed.
Yes, I think that's another challenging thing, right? Policies are always run kind of by politics. Right. And so you're reaching the midterms right now, and you're looking at saying, okay, right now, this makes pretty good sense. But with all kind of the political happenings right now, the timeline as far as something like this getting enacted, I feel like just extends out as you look at an election cycle. And so right. Do you feel that this is one of those things where, okay, it's very important right now, but if there is a political change, right, in the next election cycle, the impact that it could have could derail this completely, or it would just kind of delay it off longer?
I think companies have realized that they have to do this, like you pointed out, because of the customers' demand for it. Retirement funds demand it. Everybody is concerned about it. So maybe there's some demand from the clients, including banks or asset managers, because they know the writing is on the wall and we are all transitioning over to, better electric vehicles and so on and so forth. So there is going to be some change, but the question is, how good will the reporting be? The SEC seems to think will come out. They not only want you to report on these things, they also want you to specify your pathway to net zero. If you say you're going to be net zero or 2050, but what is your pathway forward? Because it's already 2022.
Yes, on paper, right, let's talk about your methodologies for picking ESG investments. But then you have this kind of missing angle of, okay, we're not going to define G. I think that's a missed opportunity in this proposal, in saying, okay, we're not going to force you, to say the definition, but we want you to talk about how you're getting there. Is that the right way to think about it?
There is going to be, how are we going to avoid greenwashing? When companies sort of do what are the errors of omission and commission, they either don't talk about a few things or they overly emphasize something that's not so relevant. So that's of concern, of course. So how are we going to avoid that? And are they going to strictly set up ways and means by which a company is monitored, going forward towards its net zero pathway? They also want you to specify your scope 3, which is all dependent on suppliers. So that's a tricky one too. And looking at climate materiality, it's very difficult to estimate with a great deal of certainty what is the risk for hurricanes, what's the risk for storms, what's the risk for floods or sea level rise, because the past is no longer a predictor for the future. These events are happening so frequently, and there's so much more urban infrastructure along the coast anywhere in the world, because 60% of the world's population is hugging the coastline. They live 100 miles off the coast. So if that is the case, we need to be very careful even in estimating the materiality of these climate risks. And that's something that they are asking to communicate. Like even COVID, I mean, we knew about COVID, but nobody could say what the risk on the supply chain is. It all happened and we knew we are right in the middle of it. We couldn't get masks. Now we can't get infant milk. You know, it's like we are in the middle of so many crises.
Yes, it's almost kind of nonstop, right? But there's still a lot of uncertainty. Like you said, the formula crisis, but then the war in Ukraine too, saying, okay, what effect is this going to have on, wheat exports, right? I never really considered Ukraine as a big wheat exporter, and I've learned that recently.
Oh, it's going to lead to famines. Countries like Africa, India, several of the populated parts of the world import a lot of wheat and vegetable oil from Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
So they're going to experience hunger.
Yes, it's really amazing as you kind of look at SEC's proposals on ESG, but then you go, well, let's think about this in a worldly sense. Outside of the US, like at a global level, seems like the supply chain is kind of the most important thing.
It is very difficult because we emphasize globalization as the main theme for almost 30 years, right? Ever since China came under the fold of the G7 countries, now we need to take a step back and say, not all globalization is good for us, especially food, and we haven't really done the energy transition. I wish we were less dependent on oil. The US is okay because we have natural gas. We have plenty of things to frack and go to. And we can also ramp up wind production and solar production. The rest of the world, I mean, everybody is like taken aback because they have not transitioned from fossil fuel energy. And so that's the problem. So the scope 1, 2, 3, which would be a dominant theme for companies, will also be a dominant security theme for all countries. And so we don't no longer talk about the US military and defense, for example, talks about climate security, because this is a national security issue. Lack of water, crop failure, immigrants and migrations are happening worldwide. All of this is like a huge crisis. So I think if the SEC sort of mandates, it's not just companies, but also countries have to wake up, as you sort of pointed out in your SDGs. The SDG goals, all countries have to address all of these issues. Water, sustainable livelihoods, cheap electricity, sustainable cities, life on land, life on oceans. They have to promote everything.
Yeah. I love the idea that if you focus on one or even help one, it kind of is an all boats rise conversation and say, okay, you've tackled, addressing water quality issues. And in doing so, it, helps communities where the water issue is, and it creates all these kind of ripple effects. Are you seeing that kind of on a worldly basis? Is it doing what they had hoped it did?
Well, in Cambodia, for example, I worked in Cambodia for many years. So China was building hydroelectric dams on the Mekong. There's a big part of the Mekong which becomes a lake. It's called the Tonle Sap. It pulsates with life and it controls all the fish, the production, and provides food and fish for 1 million people around in Cambodia that live around the Mekong and the Tonle Sap. So when China promised Cambodia, Thailand, Vietnam, Laos, they said, we'll give you cheap hydroelectricity. We're going to dam the Mekong. So they have started building so many hydroelectric power dams with unintended consequences. Although they have given cheap hydroelectricity, sustainable livelihoods to people, because they're able to open more and more factories, it has led to unintended consequences in terms of fish production. And they will lose out on the fish, and it's not so good in terms of food security. So there's a fine balance in terms of trade-offs of the SDGs. How much do you want of one versus the other? So it's a trade-off analysis, because as you promote one thing, it should not sort of overtake everything else, because there's a fine line.
As you talk about unintended consequences to say, okay, it sounds like it's going to really help, let's say, the S of ESG. And okay, hydroelectric's great because it's, a renewable energy, really good thing, but also the other environmental impact of that. You look at the SEC proposal in the US sense, and I feel like they did it a very stern job of saying, okay, this is greenhouse gas emissions. We want to talk about that. We want to talk about carbon, scope 1, 2, 3. But then everything else just seems adjacent to that. Do you feel that this ruling is just focused on one thing and not really the other qualities of life within the ESG?
Well, these days, Jack, we need to probably think about vulnerable population and vulnerability, because they are the very rich in the United States, and then they're the extremely poor. So we are working with the Bureau of Ocean Management on sea level rise and beach erosion along the eastern seaboard of the US. So as the beaches get eroded, the very rich towns, beaches in New York, New Jersey, Massachusetts, can go in, buy the sand and replace the beach. So they have to match the sand color and particles, buy it from out in the open ocean and bring it in. And at a certain point, it's not cost effective anymore, because it is so expensive to buy sand and haul it from the deep ocean back into the land. Whereas you see this already happening in the Carolinas. The poorer communities are unable to afford this beach nourishment. So they are just abandoning their houses because at sea level rise, they are moving inland. If you are a very poor community who has no tax base, that's what you're going to do. The town is pretty much shut down. And the rich communities can afford to keep replacing, but at a certain point, it's a law of no returns. They're going to retreat. They're going to say, we can't do this anymore. So this is part of this climate transition and climate risk that we are talking about. How does it impact communities? Of course, the SEC is interested in climate risk, but all of these climate risks only become risk to the person who lives there. It is all impactful on societies. Then comes the difference between the rich and the poor and the social justice, the environmental justice, and all of those issues. The US is looking at it. We do look at vulnerable communities. We identify them, as being people of a certain income category and, being of a certain age, a certain race, and so on. So there's recognition of that now. Poor communities are going to deal with climate crisis because they'll pay a very big price.
That's a really good way of thinking about that, right? Because on paper, you don't really think about it and go, okay, the coast is coming up. What are we going to do about that? And I think for many, it's okay, that's either my livelihood, where I've grown up, where I can only afford to live. And then if you are losing area and there's more people, where are they going to go? And I think that's a really interesting way to look at it and for people to consider, right? If you're able to affect change in the communities where maybe you don't live, but they're not going to have a place to live much longer, how can you make that change? I think that's incredibly insightful.
But if you're looking at companies per se, you need to think about agriculture and extractive industries. So we did a paper on wines. With all the wildfires happening in California, Napa Valley at certain point, even because of climate change, it is not only becoming more and more arid, lots of things are burning. That impacts the wine. A lot of winemakers are buying land in Canada, in other parts of the world. And there's also the coastal problem in Portugal and Spain and France. Because of sea level rise, water, it's not just a sea level rise. The salt water is creeping into the land and impacting soils. No plant, including wines, likes salty water. The pH level is in imbalance. So a lot of agricultural areas and very expensive products like wines are going to be impacted by climate change.
I feel like even in the past few weeks, right, there's been a lot of anti-ESG sentiment going on saying, we don't need this. People coming out and saying, I'm going to make my own company that's, focused on not the ESG, but just doing the best things. It's going to be a point where doing the best things are going to be, combating climate change, creating a better society for the workers that you hire. If they don't have a place to live and they don't have a livelihood, and you employ them, and back to the wine example, right? They can't pick the wine and produce it. Well, then that's going to be kind of an all loss situation.
Culture is that you should emphasize crops. That is like food security. We are not living on days of soil and green in a science fiction novel where we can buy the product. We need food to eat, grains to grow, and that is pretty scary. What will happen when there is so much famine and food crises elsewhere in the world? What would happen to all these people? Take a look at climate IPCC predicted maps. We thought that we could, limit the climate to 1.5 degree warming. But now the latest IPCC says that horse has already left the barn. So it's more likely 2 degrees. If you say it's 2 degrees below, you can imagine scenarios of 2 degrees, 4.5, 6.5, 8.5, which is the extreme, temperature changes that they're thinking of. It is like dire. Every part of the world looks miserable with that kind of heat and climate. So when I was in Vienna this week, I asked my students to look at different countries, different regions, look at climate change and sea level rise, and look at whether they can think about what the consequences are. They go, well, we are in Austria. Austria is deep interior. It's not going to be impacted by sea level rise. But even if there's a slight change in temperature, they can't grow their wines. They have to come up with new varieties of wine in order for it to survive the long heat in terms of, the growing season. They have to come up with more hybrid varieties, come up with new things, because they can't grow the old grape.
You must, deal with so many different students that probably come from all over the world, right? And
they come from all over the world. It is amazing.
And it must be an amazing experience, because they can take, all their experiences, learn from you as far as, this is what you need to look at as far as the global scale.
Some of them are from Asia. 2 of the students are from South Korea. And obviously, they really want to make a change in South Korea. They said that they want to sort of create all these electric charging stations. And again, in South Korea, they want to think about vulnerability of people. Who are the poor people who are going to pay for this? And as you know from the US experience, all the highways were built in Black neighborhoods. So their health got impacted with pollution and smoke and emission. So although the SEC is concerned about scope 1 and scope 2 emission, all of this has detrimental effect on human health, right? And all of the plastics that we produce is impacting reproductive health of both men and women, rich and poor. So there is health and societal consequences of greenhouse gas emission. Although they're, as you pointed out, the SEC didn't mention societal, impacts, but it does impact. So a company like Apple, a company like Amazon has to think about the society or the zip codes that it is located in. How is it helping people? Who are the people in the neighborhoods? And what are they doing? And how does their company and their emissions impact the people? Because if they don't have good relationship with the places that they are located at, they are in trouble, because they could get sued. It's not just cement companies and chemical companies that will get sued. Anybody could get sued by people. Recently, there were lawsuits where there's a big law firm in London that has brought suits on behalf of indigenous tribes in Latin America against big companies of China and other countries that are making, destroying trees and moving in to create something.
I remember hearing about that too, where companies will come in, own large forested areas, and then just rip it all up for their own gain. But then on the other side of that, companies saying, okay, we're going to plant these, big tree farms. And on paper, on the first year, it all makes good sense. But then the after effects of, well, you need to take care of the seedlings, you need to plant them the right way, you need to monitor them. And this, is a very long, investment trajectory, if you will. How is it that companies kind of get past that, right? Because they always say, we're going to do this. We've made this investment. We've gotten there, and then you're the right person to talk about it because you can track that.
Right. So we are tracking that. We are tracking that. This is an excellent question. So previously, as you know, every company that was emitting, including fossil fuels, was buying red. meaning they were buying the carbon credit in order to satisfy and balance out their emissions. And it was all great on paper. I'm planting 10 trees, for the million metric tons of damage I do. And there's no point in planting tiny little trees, conifer trees in temperate areas. You cannot destroy forest in the rainforest because that takes like thousands of years to produce and take in all that carbon. So what we are doing is we are looking at any company that wants to provide blockchain technology, plant something, and we will monitor it with using satellites and other technologies. And we will count carbon above ground and carbon below ground, because a lot of carbon is taken in by the plant and taken underground. So we are looking at measurement above and below. As you plant a seedling, we'll be able to monitor whether it's a pear fruit or a cactus or it's any type of mangroves in Indonesia. We'll be able to track it to tell you whether your carbon currency will work. And this carbon currency is going to be a cryptocurrency. The price of carbon, is like miserable. It's so low.
The carbon market's such an interesting area, and it's just right for for something new, right? Because I think the early carbon market was not well regulated, right? So you had a lot of people, finding ways to get through it, and then I think that's gotten better. But it's one of those things where you go, we need this to be innovated. And that's an incredible thing to do.
And of course, the question is the blockchain technology itself uses so much energy.
Yeah. Right? And so how does that even out, right? Because you hear about Bitcoin mining, creating these terrible things.
Right.
How do you navigate that?
So the way to navigate is like all the companies, like especially big companies like Amazon or Google, where we buy into their cloud services. I know they're already into, using low renewable energy. They have solar farms and they do all kinds of very nice things they're shrinking their footprint. So that's the kind of thing we want. With anything, we need to look at renewable sources. And as we pointed out of the ashes should come something good. Out of the ashes of COVID should come this transition to renewable energy.